Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to Meet the Editor. This is our second interview. We are delighted to be welcoming Lydia Wilson of New Lines magazine, and as well as all kinds of other cool projects that she's been involved in. I'll read a very quick bio. Lydia Wilson is culture editor at New Lines magazine and a visiting researcher at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, University of Cambridge. After completing a BA in Natural Sciences, an MPhil in History and Philosophy of Science, and a PhD in Medieval Arabic Philosophy, all from the University of Cambridge, Lydia worked in various universities in New York, Cambridge, and Oxford, researching radicalization and social conflict. She always wrote for a popular audience alongside her academic work, and also dabbled in broadcasting, presenting the BBC series, The Secret History of Writing. In January 2021, she joined New Lines as a contributing editor, expanding her role gradually until coming on full-time in 2022. Lydia, it's so great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to talk a bit about your work.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here.
So there's loads of cool things there that I would love to pick your brains about, particularly Cambridge. I actually grew up near Cambridge, and so that's my home city in the UK when I go back, although I studied in London, and now most of my family is in Spain or dotted around all over the place. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, first of all, about New Lines. I love New Lines. I feel like it's a kind of the Atlantic for a more global audience or global perspectives, and also historical perspectives, which is really nice to see. Can you tell us a bit about New Lines and how you got involved?
Yeah, so New Lines published its very first story on October the 4th, 2020. So it was a bit of a pandemic-y time, really. But the original strapline was the Middle East and beyond. And it focused only on long form, and that's still true until today. And the first model was one long essay every day, published online. Now, lots of things changed about that model, but the commitment to good long form deep dive treatments of subjects hasn't changed, and also the perspective. So going and finding the stories that are important to people in different places and getting those people to write about it rather than outsiders writing about it, all of that has remained. We do newsletters, so some of our essays are a little bit shorter now, and we have gone fully global, because as anyone who's ever had anything to do with the Middle East knows, it's global already. You can't really deal with any of those countries without most of the world's, all of the world's superpowers. So that was New Lines, and actually one of my friends was involved from the beginning, and he wrote to me this cryptic message: oh, I'm involved in this new project, oh, kind of, we're aiming for New Yorker of the Middle East kind of vibe. So you saying Atlantic of global affairs, that's exactly what we want to hear. And have you got any essays? And I was like, I've been waiting all my life for this. And I sent off a bunch of things. They took 2. So my essays were in the first week, and then a month later. And then when they expanded the editorial team, they looked to their writers, you know, who'd already published. And so I came on board in January, just as a contributing editor, and I slowly just increased, got to be full-time last April.
Fantastic. And what's it like working is it a remote kind of newsroom? I'm imagining if it's long form, it's not really sort of the same kind of ultra high speed journalism that we're used to seeing, which really I'm so happy to see, because I think I love long form. I love sitting down and diving into a topic, and I kind of avoid newspapers, I've got to say, because I find it so bitty and so distracting. Like you'll be reading an article, and then it's like, read about this as well. Like you haven't even gone halfway in, and it's already telling you about other things to read, and I get very distracted. So I really enjoy that kind of writing.
Great.
What were some of the things you first started writing about when you joined them?
My first one was about the birth of the birth of the alphabet in about 1000 something BC. And it's a very specific topic, but a lovely story about history. A bunch of immigrants invented the alphabet because they were basically jealous of the Egyptians' hieroglyphs, but they couldn't understand it themselves. They themselves were illiterate, so they kind of invented this phonetic way of doing it. But then I did a reportage piece about Syria because, you know, Syria, it's very hard to keep Syria, long form Syrian stories in the news. There's a tendency to treat it as a refugee story or a geopolitical story, not really reporting from Syria itself. And then, yeah, I mean, I've written on so many different subjects, reviews of podcast series. I've done a lot of history, lots of archaeology. That's kind of my main beat, probably.
Sorry, I asked you earlier and then immediately veered off about the sort of atmosphere of working for New Lines.
The newsroom aspect. Yes, so we do respond to topical events, but we just try and do it in our own way. So there's an aspect of the newsroom, but of course it's all done remotely. And so the question always is there a way we can do this differently? Is there a New Lines treatment of what's going on? And if there isn't, we won't cover it. If we can't add something distinctive to the story, we're not just going to add extra noise. For a start, we don't have the space for that. We want every single story to count. We don't have any padding because we only do one essay a day. So I mean, we're all in different time zones, so that makes things awkward in a way if you're waiting for somebody to wake up, but at the same time we cover so many time zones, which is very useful when something's going on. So yeah, it's just that whole pandemic working from home kind of set us all up beautifully to work together like this.
That's amazing. What's the kind of turnaround between having an idea for a story or a pitch coming in? I'll ask a little bit more about pitching in just a moment, but what's the sort of turnaround if you are not necessarily having to respond to things sort of within a 24-hour sort of time frame?
We try to be timely about responses. There's no set timeline for essays because we take the editing process so very seriously. I mean, every single essay gets 5 pairs of eyes minimum on it. So that depends on how much work there is to do on it, how quick the author is at replying, all of those kind of things. So there's no specific timeline for the whole process. In terms of emails, we should get back to people very quickly, quite often to say, I'm overloaded right now, I can't get to your essay for a few days. That can happen. But so editing can take a long time. And we take that seriously because we want different people's voices, and then they don't always write. For example, if the English isn't their first language, but they've got a story that we really value, we'll work hard to kind of turn that into kind of better standard writing. Or if we've got a different type of expertise and they're not writers, again, we'll work with them to turn that into something. So yeah, it can take a long time, but we think it's worth it.
I was just about to ask you about that as well, because I find that really, I feel is one of the most critical kind of questions in media and in journalism. And I've noticed that in some online and print sort of broadsheets and even tabloids, it seems to be quite dominated by actually quite privileged voices. And it's sort of quite scary in some ways to see that the materials that we end up reading can actually be produced by a very small segment of society who have been trained in those ways and have had access to that kind of training. And that's part of our raison d'etre, is to be able to, expand those opportunities and train people in skills that are useful in long form essay writing, for example, or as well as other things, poetry, short stories, things like this. So yeah, it's really exciting to see that.
It's a problem though, isn't it? Because
Yes.
we only get very small amounts of perspectives through the media, certainly in Britain, and probably most countries, I would say, are dominated by the elites. So yeah, it's really problematic. And that's what we're fighting against, to find those different perspectives.
Do you ever do like a call for submissions on particular topics through Twitter or something like this?
Not really, no. We want to know what the stories out there are. We want to be surprised. I mean, we have had a call about peripheries, but yeah, that's not really how we do things. The submissions guidelines are very detailed on our website, so do have a look at them before you submit. Before you pitch, because it kind of does explain what a New Lines essay is and what the process is and how to pitch. And yeah, we're looking for we're looking for new types of stories. So we wouldn't ever want to specify too much what they might be. We don't want anyone writing to us shaping their story into our mold. Right. So yeah, I don't think a call for submissions is the right thing to do. I think it's better just to see what people have.
Interesting. And how do people find you? Is it mostly through social media or word of mouth?
I think it must be social media. I mean, yeah, our writers are growing all the time and they spread the word. So I quite often these days get pitches that have been passed along through existing writers. And I help with the history essay, which we have a history essay every Friday. And I help with that project. And I quite often these days get emails from professors' students. Oh, my professor said that you might look at this kind of thing. So that it's spreading word of mouth as well through our existing writer network.
That's very organic and also a very good sign. It shows that people want to write for you, which is sort of what you want, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's been very nice. And the feedback as well. So many people are seeing that we are doing something different, and crucially we're giving the space for these stories because it is online only, and because we are so committed to long form, we can publish very long deep dives into subjects.
That is absolutely wonderful. I wanted to ask you a little bit about earlier I mentioned when I read your bio that you had done research, and you mentioned as we were chatting before beginning this interview that you'd spent time in Iraq. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your research? It sounds fascinating.
Oh, well, it has changed an awful lot. I've changed direction a lot. My PhD was actually history. It was on Al-Farabi, the 10th century philosopher. But after that, I did switch to the 20th century, 21st. And I was looking at radicalization and social conflict and the dynamic between the two of terrorism and social divisions and conflict and polarization. So I worked in various universities, but always in teams, and I was often the field worker for big projects on radicalization. So when ISIS came onto the scene, all the funding kind of got skewed that way. We all frantically worked on ISIS, is what it felt like. It felt like the world was working on ISIS. So I ended up spending, I went to Iraq a couple of times a year, I think, for the next few years, for, you know, all of that kind of ISIS time, 2014 onwards. But I also at the same time was doing fieldwork in Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, and also Northern Ireland and Kosovo. You know, similar dynamics of kind of sectarian strife to one extent or another, and to what extent that drove radicalization to violence.
Wow, amazing. I'm really fascinated about how present history is in your work. And sorry, I just let a motorbike go past my window. I'm right by a very small but fairly main road. And in New Lines, about how you mentioned that you went from Al-Farabi to 20th century sectarian conflict. I mean, do you sort of get sometimes like this sort of feeling of the past being very present and how important it is that we need to, I mean, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you know, what do you see as the importance of understanding history and keeping it relevant?
I mean, not only is the past very present in that it's shaped the present, but the past is used to give us certain national narratives or identity-based narratives. And so I mean, we saw that very much during the Brexit debates, that how narratives around empire and, you know, these mythical golden past that all nationalist kind of populist parties are selling their populations all over the world, that once we were strong, and I will be the one to take you to that strongness again, or, you know, there's always been
Make America Great Again.
Yeah, Make America Great Again is key, or Britain First, or whichever it was that Hungary, Italy, they're all kind of selling these very nostalgic views of the past. And I think we need to be more aware and more alert to that. And I think that popular writing is one way to do that, to lay lie to some of these claims about who we are.
What do you think, since we have our membership of Muslims I don't think we actually have any Muslims, any non-Muslims here. We're being a bit elitist here, but that's because we're trying to create a safe space, a nurturing space where Muslims can not have to explain themselves and not have to, you know, try and be anything for anybody else, in order to try and get their words together, which I'm struggling to do a little bit today. I'm just a little bit like overheated. What do you think about, obviously not everybody who is writing for New Lines is Muslim, but since given the sort of historic focus on the Middle East, what do you think about Muslim representation in media and or self-representation? I'm thinking particularly, or that the contrast between representation and self-representation, and what do you think that we can do about it, or what do you think is currently being done?
I mean,
I think large question there.
It is large. It's a big question. I think, and also I think it's changing, and I think it's changing quite rapidly. And I think ISIS was a blip in an otherwise quite good direction of travel in terms of Muslim representation, and then that undid a lot of that work because all sorts of very lazy reporting was done around that phenomenon that did mischaracterize Islam and Muslims and sectarianism vastly. But apart from that, I was beginning to hope that the direction of travel was good. Of course, there was the 9/11 blip, which was rather bigger than the ISIS blip in terms of shaping perceptions of Islam and Muslims. I don't know, maybe I'm optimistic. I'm not the person really to ask because I'm not Muslim. I was just hoping that I was seeing more Muslims on screen. I think there's very many more prominent hijabis. I think in politics as well as the media, which both are important. In terms of how people write about Islam, yes, there's still a huge amounts of ignorance in English language media. But I really like to think that initiatives like New Lines and other things, and Critical Muslim in Britain and very many other outlets, we are just helping kind of move that juggernaut that is the media. It's so slow to move, but we are just kind of nudging it in a better direction because of the depth we give to a lot of these issues. So our history essays, you know, we've got an essay on the history of the theology of abortion in Islam, and it came out when Roe v. Wade was overturned, to show how much more liberal Islam has always been around women's bodies than current America, which isn't hard.
Right.
But always, not just now, but always, it's in the theology, it's in the fiqh texts. And that's just one example. We've got many such kind of theological and historical essays on bits and pieces of Islam that have really important ramifications for the present day, like the age of Aisha. You know, it matters because people, when she married the Prophet, it matters because people use things like that to allow child marriage. And if it's not true, that's taken away, that kind of support that people think there is for child marriage. Or on the other hand, the accusations to Muslims of paedophilia, that's taken away if we challenge the very basis of it. So, I mean, these things get circulated a lot and get picked up by the mainstream media. So many of our stories have been picked up in mainstream media. So I just hope that we have a role in kind of tweaking it, and then hopefully slowly the attitudes will change in general. We'll just have a better informed media.
Yeah, as a kind of a trickle down effect. I love the fact that your stories that you've picked up on and not chasing the day-to-day story, the historical stories then end up trickling down into mainstream media. That's
yeah.
So what kind of advice would you have for writers in general, but I'm thinking particularly, obviously our members are Muslim and concerned, I think myself as a Muslim, and I have always been Muslim, and my parents converted before I was born, and I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was very young. And at a certain point, I was very excited about writing. I loved writing. I was always writing stories, and you know, I was also very academic, and so I sort of thought, well, I can write essays and whatnot. But at a certain point, I think my confidence dropped greatly, because I felt that I sort of hit a wall of feeling like I'm not really going to be able to represent myself kind of adequately in a broader, you know, context, like a broader platform. I don't want to be sort of sacrificing my voice. I don't want to be sort of pigeonholing myself or putting myself into a box. And I get the feeling, and maybe I'm wrong here, and please, by all means, everybody who's joined us, put comments in the chat. I don't have Nafisa with me today to keep an eye on the chat, but I will do my best to keep an eye on it. And if you have any questions, please do drop your questions down there, or just your comments and your reactions to the conversation. Where was I?
Yeah, writing and representing and misrepresenting.
Exactly. And I think I kind of get the feeling that many Muslims feel that if you're going to be a Muslim writer, you have to write about certain topics. Like, let's say you're writing a novel or fiction, and it has to be, especially if you're a Muslim woman. Like, obviously not all of our members are women, but I think a majority are. And so there's always this kind of fear that, you know, will I really be able to be free to write as I wish to write? You know, am I going to be free to write about the topics faithfully and authentically? And I don't know where I'm going with this, because I don't think this is specifically a question for you.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about. I mean, from a very specifically New Lines point of view, rather than a novel or anything, just focus on the story you have. And in journalism in general, always check the submission guidelines and anything that the editor has said online. Tailor every pitch you do very carefully, because we are inundated with pitches. We have far more pitches than we could ever publish the stories. And so if it clearly isn't right for us, it's actually easy to say no. We're not going to say, oh, by the way, if you tweak it like this and do this, and do you know anything about this? Because if you did this, it could be a New Lines essay. Right. No, we're responding to your pitch. And so make sure you get it right for the publication you're pitching to. Make it easier for the editor to say yes, or at least ask questions. Make it kind of irresistible, you know, make it as tempting as you can. Because if you can't tempt an editor, you can't tempt a reader. And so that's, and in terms of kind of, yeah, the anxiety of who you are or how you write, just let the story speak for itself. That's what all editors are really looking for. The stories that nobody else has, or told in a way that nobody else can. And so if you are confident in your ideas, I think the kind of worry about who you might be less important.
That's a really lovely way of putting it. So then you're not sort of thinking about who am I, you're thinking about what is the story, what am I actually getting on with the writing of the story, and then just allowing yourself to be who you are. Yeah. That's just come through naturally. Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you so much. And I will share the link to the submissions guidelines in the caption when I share it on our platform. Ambata asks, I would like to know more about building a strong editorial team and nurturing and sustaining writers. These are my challenges as an editor of a publication. It's a really interesting question.
Another editor, great. Yeah. I mean, I guess our team has been built through robust discussions, and because we're trying to do something new and different, there's a lot of fascinating discussions we have about what makes a New Lines essay, for example, or how to cover different issues that are coming up in the news, what we can do to make things a little bit different. And it's those discussions that really kind of build a team, I think, because there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of new ideas, there's a lot of brainstorming, there's a lot of shooting each other's ideas down, as well as or you know, building them. That's one thing. Nurturing writers is completely different, isn't it? And writers vary so much in terms of how they deal with edits, for example. And you have to really feel your way with each one, I feel. And another major tip is just try and work with the editor, because if it's too much like hard work, we won't use you again because we don't want to go through it again. However good you are, if it's too much work for us, it's not a very tempting proposition to repeat it. Does that answer the question? Sustaining writers, nurturing and sustaining writers, that is a really interesting way of putting it.
Yeah,
because you do want to develop certain writers, don't you, if you feel they are just nearly there. I mean, we just do put quite a lot of time into editing, so we nurture people that way. And I do try, if I'm killing an idea either at pitch or draft stage, I try and explain why it's not right for us, so that people don't get discouraged about writing in general. It's like, and quite often I'll say, this isn't right for us, but do you want to try, I don't, Jadalia or Middle East Eye or Al Jazeera, because I can see the idea. It's just will never be on our website, but I will suggest other places for it. So that's another way of just, even when there's bad news, you kind of try and give some good advice along with that.
Does that answer the question, Ambarta?
Yeah, thank you. I recognize that my question might be, I didn't know if it was best suited for you, right, in your role as an editor, because I'm more of a managerial editor, and we're a small publication, very low budget. We're trying to build, like what you're saying about New Lines is like our aspiration, for our journal, so just wanted to, but since I had a moment to talk with the editor. But
what's the publication?
Sapelo Square.
Okay,
we've been
great.
publishing for 7 years, and I've been with them for, I think, maybe 3 years. Yeah, because I started in 2020. I started as the arts and culture editor, and the founder, she has moved on, and so I'm not filling her role, but I'm now the senior editor. Okay. So, and I'm a writer, so this is kind of like new territory for me, so that this type of editing, I my start was developmental editing, like working with authors, so this is all new for me, but so we're like this really small dedicated team, and we're trying to grow, so that this is our like current challenge, is like to grow, to be at the stage where we're like having so many pitches we have to turn them down, and and trying to build up that type of like team that can, like what you're describing, right, where like working together, and so that, yeah, just that's where we would like to be. Yeah.
That's maybe from more of a business perspective that I wouldn't have. I mean, obviously the social media is key if you're trying to attract more writers. I think that is where most of our interest and kind of platform has come from. And yeah, events, actually, we've had a lot of in-person events around the world, and I think that's kind of driven our profile a little bit too. We've had some very nice salons in London, but also events all over America and the Middle East. So you can think about driving up interest that way.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is all really helpful. I've been taking notes to share because what you were saying about like the editorial process, that's something that we, go through a lot. And so that's something to think about, like extending the editorial process. Our tendency is to like try to stay within a certain frame, and then it hardly ever works with it. We say, 6 to 8 weeks, and it hardly ever happens. So, that's something to think about. Like maybe, we do away with, this time frame. Yeah. And when it's, that's my feeling, is like when it's ready, that's when you publish it,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, maybe you don't need it. I mean, topical, yes, but anything else, why should there be a time frame? I mean, you don't want it to stretch into years, obviously. But
it kind of reminds me of Tortoise, actually, the news platform, and their slogan is, I think it's a British publication. I don't know if you would have heard of it, Ambarta, or maybe online, but their slogan is the news, not when it happens but when it's ready, or something like that. Like their sort of whole approach is to do things, kind of digest it a little bit more, which I mean, to me, it feels like the whole purpose of writing. And we talked about this in the last meeting with another Suad Kamardin, about writing as a sort of digestion, and like that's kind of what makes it so pleasurable to do. And to be able to do that more slowly, it gives you a real luxury as well, to be able to sort of say, I'm going to really allow myself to read up on this and read around it, and produce something that is actually really worth reading and not just rushed through, which is really amazing. And it's incredible to have the luxury of doing that. And I don't want to sort of poke around too much in a journalistic way, but do you is New Lines supported by advertising? Or I mean, it seems like a very robust sort of business to be able to support that level of having 5 sets of eyes on an essay. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, we're lucky. We have a publisher, we have a funder, and I think that is pretty much the only model left in really high quality journalism now. I don't think people want to pay for news. I don't think advertisers are getting much out of online publications anymore, or offline publications actually. And so I think journalism has been scrabbling around for years. And I think this is one of the rare ways of keeping quality high. We're very lucky.
Wow, amazing. I don't really have any more questions other than just sort of the general thing, like what's your day-to-day working life like? You work from home?
I work from home.
Lovely. The new normal.
Exactly. I mean, home or cafes, work in cafes quite a lot. And I write a lot. I write an extended essay a month of my own, and I edit probably, I'm always got a long list of essays to edit, because so many of them take more than one round, that I try and deal with an essay a day probably. And then we have our meetings, but I also spend a lot of time supporting the print team. We are in print every quarter, so I do a lot of that. I do support work for them, so I read a lot of the submissions and give my verdicts, but also do a lot of some of the proofing. I do the podcast along with colleagues. I do events along with colleagues. So yeah, there's no typical working day apart from the writing and the editing is always, but then regular meetings. Oh yeah, we're doing all sorts of other really exciting spin-offs. We taught a course as a team at New York University last semester.
On long form essay writing.
On long form essay writing.
Might have to somehow coax you over to Muslim Writer Salon to do a workshop.
We're launching Essay Bootcamp very soon, if everyone wants to keep an eye on that. Essay Bootcamp. Yeah, we are. I mean, we're going to have one very much geared towards academics, because we are trying to attract more academics all the time. And in editing academics, I've noticed a lot of the common pitfalls they make, but we will expand it to all sorts of writers. And so, yeah, I'm always working on random things, it feels like. Quite a lot of emergency editing when something is topical. So I edited a piece on Sinead O'Connor last Friday. You know, those sorts of things I can react to. But yeah, every day, some writing, some editing.
Do your just based on what you just said, does your print quarterly journal, your quarterly print journal, does that draw on things that have been published digital, or is it a completely separate publication?
They haven't been published when they go into print, but they end up on the website later.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
that is interesting. I was going to ask you another question about advice for academics transitioning out of purely dry academic text, because this is another thing that's come up a lot for our members, that people who've been introduced to writing perhaps as children loved stories and loved novels and whatnot, or maybe often getting a little bit older, getting into poetry, but then the actual training has been, their training in writing has tended to be academic, and then sort of having to detox from that a little bit and learning how to write from a personal perspective, and how to flesh out characters and description and all these kinds of things. Like, is there any advice that you would give for somebody who's in that process?
I mean, there's a lot of advice I can give. And for the full experience, do sign up to Essay Bootcamp when we launch it. Keep an eye on our Twitter for the announcement. It should be coming any minute. But open in, so the way I put it is that academics they kind of build, you've got an introduction, you've got your data and methods and all the rest of it, you build to a conclusion, and that's where the payoff is. The payoff is right at the end. We need it twisted 180 degrees. We need to know why this is interesting at the start, otherwise nobody will read it.
Right.
So you start a paragraph, a typical way of doing it, and there are no rules in this. You can make an essay gripping in all sorts of ways, but an easy kind of way into thinking about it is start in medias res, in the middle of the action. Start with an anecdote. This happened 4,000 years ago, and we don't know why. And then you follow it with what we call the nutgraf, which is, why is this important? Give us a reason to keep reading. So first of all, you catch somebody's attention with an odd anecdote, and then you give the reason to carry on reading to the end. So it's like, this matters because what we thought about the ancient Egyptians isn't the case, and that has knock-on effects for the way we think about everything that came after. You know, you give people a sense of why it's important in the second paragraph. So you're kind of yeah, and then one paragraph at a time, tell us why you're telling us. And if you can't tell us why you're telling us, cut that paragraph out. There's no spare words in a popular essay, because everybody reading it has 400 other tabs open at any one time on their computer that they could be reading instead of your essay. Give everyone a reason to keep on reading.
Wow. It's very rigorous, isn't it? That's kind of what I like about essays, because you do have to condense like all of the sort of like afternoons you spent daydreaming about that and all those thoughts that you've had and all the notes that you've started writing and all of your post-it notes, and you have to sort of kind of condense it right down into this thread. But like you say, it needs to have the hook. And then what was the word you used for the second paragraph?
Nutgraf, as in the kernel. When you boil down everything, what's left? How do you tell me about it in 2 sentences?
Oh, I love that expression. That just feels like, but it feels like that could also apply to poetry and other kinds of writing, right? Because there's something,
Poetry,
there's like
yeah.
an essence there. Nutgraf. Oh, there it is. Look, I've never seen that. I've never seen that word before. A new word. This is
Other publications do call it other things, but I find I've forgotten what they are. But there are other words floating around for that.
Is that a German word?
Well, graph is always spelt like that in journalism. You know how they spell things wrong so that it doesn't sneak into publication.
Why did they write it like that? So that your autocorrect or your proofreader will grab it.
Yeah, so anything that isn't ending up in the final copy gets spelt wrong on purpose. You know, no.
I did not know this. I did not know this.
So yeah, headline without an A kind of thing. Yes. But I noticed putting that into the chat that there were questions.
What does sked mean? Just before we go back and look at the other question.
Schedule.
Oh, okay. Schedule is very English, or is that British or American? I don't even know.
Schedule.
Schedule sounds American to me. Sked. The sked.
Oh,
okay,
really?
adopt these.
Schedule is American English.
Schedule is American and schedule is
yes.
British.
Yes. That's what I thought.
I don't even know, because I have both. I'm American English, and I really struggle sometimes with knowing the differences. But I've done a lot of proofreading and I'd never come across that before. So that's really fun to know, but I haven't. Okay, so Bayan says, any advice for a poet trying to navigate the publishing world, specifically with finding the right resources to grow, edit, and find a team to self-publish or a traditional publisher? I'm not sure if this question is for this conversation Or perhaps what magazines or literary journals look for when publishing poetry pieces or guest pieces, if New Lines handles that?
We don't do any poetry at New Lines, I'm afraid. I have published poetry when I was editor of the Cambridge Literary Review. Poetry, as you probably know, if you're already writing, doesn't pay. Very few journals. You'd have to end up in the New Yorker or somewhere like that for for someone to pay for poetry. But there are a lot of literary journals out there if you're okay with not being paid. And so, you know, some of the big reviews of the Chicago Literary Review, the Chicago Review, Boston Review, you know, you kind of search around for those sorts of places. That's where most people start, I would say. But again, do the homework. This goes for any kind of publishing. Do the homework on the review you're sending it to. And if your stuff doesn't fit, don't send it, because it won't get published and you're wasting your time and their time. Just find the journal that publishes your kind of thing and then reach out to that editor.
I think that's very good advice. And also, I think America has many more of these journals, I've noticed. The UK is a kind of a small market. Would you agree? I mean, America's got
definitely
a number of readers. Just the sheer number of universities, and every university has its own press, and it, you know, practically every, I think pretty much every university in the US has its own review of some kind. It has some kind of journal, and so they'll have stories and poems. But often you do have to pay something for a reading fee, or it depends. You can find places that don't charge. It feels grueling. I've got to tell you, from my experience sending off things to poetry reviews, it does feel grueling. I think part of the hardest part of that is knowing what is my stuff like, and therefore how do I figure out where it goes. And I guess that the best thing to do is to find readers and people who, I don't know if you would agree, you know, editors or people who are used to doing a lot of reading, who can kind of help you to analyze or categorize your work a little bit and be able to say, oh, this is the sort of journal that you should go for. And that feels like a whole task in and of itself, you know. And I hope this is in some ways answering your question, Bayan. But also finding a team to self-publish. I found that a lot of our members are either already actively pursuing self-publishing, and I've done a lot of a certain amount of self-publishing, and for other people as well, going down self-publishing routes for somebody else. When you know that it's a very niche topic, and you know it's going to have a very small kind of readership, but you know it's going to be a very devoted readership. And it is a big thing, though. I mean, self-publishing is not for the faint of heart. It is something that you kind of need to have a lot of practice with, and have professionals on hand, editors, proofreaders, designers, things like that, because a self-published book can very easily look like a self-published book, and it tends to put people off quite a lot. That's just been my sort of experience. Does that answer your question, Bayan, or would you like to add anything?
No, yeah, it does. It answers it. And also, I'm glad I'm based in the US then, if you're saying that there's more journals out here that will publish things. But yeah, I think essentially that's what I usually hear about publishing poetry, is that it doesn't necessarily go, which is why I think self-publishing is pretty much the option. But yeah, that's why I was asking about resources, because connecting with professionals and editors, and I do have an editor, but like other professionals as well with design and things like that, it's just hard to like find the right pockets. So that's why I was asking.
We are going to have a launch for a book that's coming out through Lotry Press, and that was one of the only, I think it's the only really sort of Muslim specific poetry publishers that I know of, and it's run by a very old friend called Rabia Spiker. We began, actually, all of these things seem to begin as Facebook groups or something on Instagram, or I don't know. So much of it has been born from social media, which is so frustrating and yet so fascinating at the same time. But I think it's because Muslims are so dispersed, with such a dispersed population, and you know, people can have so many you know, international connections, that actually social media is really one of the places that communities can flourish. So that actually grew out of a Facebook group that we still going. But she does the designs for those books herself, and I think she's now as Lydia said, because poetry is so hard to make money from, she's going to start moving. I'll let her explain it herself, but I have also seen other publishers, poetry publishers like Waterloo Press, moving into a model where it's sort of partly sponsored by the writer, or at least you kind of show that there's enough of a readership that they'll be able to invest into it, kind of thing. But there are so many poets that have gone completely viral on social media, and you know that they're not writing sort of poetry that you know, Poetry Magazine would publish. It's something quite different. It's more popular, it's more accessible, or it just speaks to a particular crowd. And by gaining that popular kind of base, is that the right word? When they do self-publish something, they have this channel that they can you know, market to. But bearing in mind, from my marketing knowledge, only about 1%, or probably less than 1% of your followers on Instagram will buy something that you advertise to them on it, but about 10% of people on a newsletter will. So that's why newsletters are quite often sort of more desirable, and you know, starting a blog and developing a newsletter through that can be quite useful. I think we should definitely look more into the blog element, because you know, Substack, Medium, WordPress, what are all the pros and cons? I don't know. Do you already share your poetry online, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And I also have like my own newsletter through my business. So it's like, I think that's why self-publishing kind of might fit. So hopefully that's the route that we'll take. But yeah, it's just, I think a little like disheartening that poetry sometimes doesn't seem to have a place in the traditional publishing world. I think, I don't know why I find that, you know, a little challenging when I think it deserves a little bit more respect. But I think, like you're saying, there is something to self-publishing in it being a little bit more accessible, especially with the language, I guess I could share it on social media. So that might, you know, there's pros and cons to everything. But would you mind sharing the name? You, what was it, Waterley, or I'm sorry, I missed her name.
Waterloo Press. I noticed, I just checked recently, and they're not accepting submissions, but it's edited by Naomi Foyle, who's an amazing poet. It's a British-based poetry press, as the name gives it away. Waterloo. Sorry. Ambata says Rupi Kaur is self-published, and she sold millions of copies of her books. Exactly. And Nikita Gill, I think, also developed her following through social media. So yeah, what can we say about that? Lydia, do you have any other thoughts about self-publishing?
I mean, there's lots of poetry. Like self-publishing, I'm afraid I don't really know very much about, but there are a lot of poetry outlets out there where you can start being part of a poetry community.
Yeah, it's that's what I'm also trying to get into, is people in places, in person out here as well, and to join those communities. It's just a matter of finding them. But again, I'm based in the US, so we might have a little bit more different groups than online.
Whereabouts are you based, if you don't mind me asking?
Near Chicago.
Oh, there's so much poetry in Chicago.
Yeah, there's a lot of groups. There's a lot. So I'm just trying now to, you know, after COVID, I think it's like everybody's trying to get back in person now. And so I feel like COVID kind of decimated the writing scene a little bit in Chicago. So now everybody's just now starting to get back into the rhythm. So I guess it's just a matter of like over time building that community. So
I think that's the word, is community, and another related word is network, although it sounds a little bit more businessy. But I have found almost every time, every connection, like connecting to Lydia was through somebody that I knew, mutual contacts, and having those connections, that's really key to it. Because first of all, as Lydia mentioned earlier, I don't know if you were in the conversation at that point, Bayan. Sorry, I've just drawn a blank. That was out of my brain today. Yes, sorry, that many of the writers are approaching New Lines through their own networks of writers, rather than it being like, you know, making open calls and things like that. So people are kind of finding out about New Lines and approaching them themselves. But having those networks between writers is just so essential, because one writer will be like, oh, did you hear about this award that's closing soon? Or, you know, all of these things. This is how we kind of make those connections. And even when I was researching, I posted to our membership platform a resource about writing a query letter, And when I was researching it, what a lot of agents said was, you know, if we've met somewhere, mention that in the first line. If you heard me speaking on a podcast, you know, mention that some way that shows that we have a potential kind of personal connection, you know. And we had a book club recently with Layla, who I'm always going on about and fangirling about. But that connection came through my mum, who had met her at a conference, and they'd gotten chatting, and so we got into email communication. So it's just it's funny because writing can seem so lonely and so solitary, that actually conversely the ways that we grow as writers and end up publishing and sharing our work, it's actually through these human connections, which I guess we just have to develop those systems and those sort of sorry, I've got so much noise going on past me. I hope
We
it doesn't
can't hear it.
You can't hear it. It's just kids screaming up and down now.
Oh.
Anyway, thank you all so much. Is there any other questions anybody has they want to jump in?
I would say that networking is the takeaway for probably all of life, but definitely writing.
It seems like such a paradox, doesn't it? Like to be writing, you have to spend time away from people and be alone. And like I'm, you know, just begging my husband to give me some time alone so that I can, you know, take the kid away so I could go and do some writing. And yet, you know, it's like this seesaw almost. You have to spend that time alone to be able to do that deep diving and the researching and the work, and then seesawing out again, kind of the in and out sort of oscillation, which is, I guess, also just life, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't want to keep you any longer. Lydia, thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's been fascinating to hear about your work and everything that New Lines is doing, which is fascinating. I really hope that, and urge our members also to think about writing. If you do long form essays, if you do literary nonfiction, or if you're interested in history, definitely I would say they're kind of like one of the premium places to submit to. And when I post this on our platform, I will put I write in the caption the link to the submissions guidelines. Sahara says, thank you, so many gems of information shared, much appreciated. And Bartos says, thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much, Medina.
And it's lovely to meet you at last and put a face to the email.
And please pitch, everybody.
Yes, go ahead and pitch, but in the right way.
Yes.